Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Friday evening. Let's see. There we go. Think I'm all set up. Suze, how you doing? Good to see you there. Looks like it's you and me and a couple others just to get started. And always have to readjust my settings just a little bit. There we go. All right. And welcome. I hope it has been a good day for you. And this is going to be the final show of the week at Friday night. And there's going to be no Rocky Stucci Situation Room tonight. So we're kind of open ended. We could go for 5 hours tonight. So Susie Q, good to see you. Nigel, how you doing, brother? And I'm glad that you're here. We're going to give people a couple of minutes to come on in, but we'll just do a little mindless chatting for a minute or two. And my family is all gone for the weekend, which is kind of nice. I got to tell you, I love my wife and kids, but they're gone for the weekend up to their family's cabin with some relatives. And so that's kind of nice because that gives me a little bit of time to just be a bachelor for 48 to 72 hours, somewhere in that range, and get a few things done without jumping up and down, helping with kids, helping with stuff, doing family stuff, and all of that. It's not that I don't have tasks I got to get done around here, but it's kind of nice to have the quiet every now and then. So that's where I am now. And Nigel, I'm doing great so far. So hopefully, don't know how the voice is yet tonight. We'll see how things go as we get going. And it's been getting gradually better. So hopefully, my voice will last through the whole thing. And Teresa, good to see you. And glad that you're here as well. And top of the morning from Sydney, Australia. Hey, how about that? That's right. It's like next week in Australia. Um, Something like that. You are in the future. So good to see you here. I think depending on where you are in Australia, oh, you're Sydney. So let's see. I don't know my geography all that well in Australia, but you're about 14 hours ahead of us here, I do believe. So it's 9 p.m. Central Standard Time here in the United States, and 10 p.m. out east. And we're I'm not even going to get into politics. I was going to start to go into some current events. Let's skip current events. I'm tired of politics this week. I got to tell you, it's in a way, it's nice to not have the Situation Room tonight. We didn't have to talk politics, although I've had my fill already today in other arenas, and it's amazing to me how lacking in respect everybody has gotten over this last political cycle and the one that's coming. And so it gets really tiresome after a while. You can't, social media, you either have to ignore it or you're in it. And so you don't want to say anything. You don't want to answer any questions. You don't want to comment on anything if you don't want to have a discussion for where you have to take sides or come down and say, this is what I believe. I did a little genealogical research, and some of you may know this. I've mentioned this many times that my family tree here in the United States goes back to before the United States was founded, back in the early 1700s. I had my ancestors came over in 1710 from Wales, the Robards at the time, and then Robards got changed to Roberts somewhere along the way over the next 100 years, as it shows up in court records and things like that. And the original founder of the family here in America was John Robards. And I was going to mention that in doing my genealogical research, my father was born in 1938. But his father was only 21 years old at the time, 1938, and he died of tuberculosis. He was in a tuberculosis sanatorium in Kentucky back in 1938, and died at only 21 years old. So I'm already almost 3 times as old as my paternal grandfather ever lived to be. He was just a kid. But then in turn, his father, which would be my paternal great grandfather, you'll see where I'm going with this. I was talking about politics and I got on this. My great grandfather, Stephen Foster Roberts, lived in Kentucky. And in 1926, it was November, I think it was the 2nd or the 4th of 1926, he was murdered. He was sitting at the local Five and Dime. If you're familiar with the Andy Griffith Show, way back when some of us were kids, Mayberry. It was that type of a little town. And all the gang, his guys, they were all sitting together down at the Five and Dime, which was also the post office, having soda pops. And it was election day in 1926. And there was a political discussion going on. And he and another one of their cronies, my great grandfather, and he got into a little spat argument over politics. And the one guy huffed off and left and came back a little while later with a shotgun. And the way the story reads in the old newspapers was he was threatening my great grandfather because they were in political disagreement. And my great grandfather jumped off down. He was sitting up on the countertop drinking a soda pop, and he jumped off the countertop and said something to the guy with the shotgun. I'm imagining he said, "Put the gun down," kind of thing. I don't recall them saying in the article what he did say, but he jumped down off the countertop and confronted the guy with the gun, and the guy shot him in the chest. And he died a short time later. And then that man went to trial and I believe was found guilty, but I did not see the newspaper clippings from the final result of the trial. So there you go. There is political talk gone awry. My own great grandfather was murdered because somebody didn't like his politics and they were arguing about politics. And I don't think there was, when it was an argument, I want to say, from what I read of the story, it was all a bunch of friends hanging out, young men, late 20s, early 30s. And they were all sitting around down at the Five and Dime and talking politics. The one guy didn't like it, ended up in an altercation and murdered my great grandfather. That was in 1926 is when that happened. So you're looking at almost 100 years ago now. So, Jennifer, good to see you. First time you've caught this live. It's 3:15 a.m. But where are you, Jennifer? If it's 3:15 a.m., are you in England? Great Britain? Somewhere over there? You're a Roberts, so you're probably some kind of shoestring relative of mine. And Jeannie, good to see you. Yeah, the old drugstores had soda jerks. You're right. Yep, you're in the UK. Okay. Well, it's good to have you here, Jennifer. I'm glad you're here live. I'm glad you're wide awake at 3:15 a.m. And let's see. Iowa X, you're here. Suze is here. Ruth is here. Good to see you. And Susie Q, Teresa, I think that's everybody who's here. Nigel, you're here. And so, and Jeremy Hansen. Good to see you, Jeremy. Great to have you here live. And hope everything's going well. Scott Dowers, how you doing? Yeah, you're here. And you know what? Rocky Stucci's sister, Lisa, she says she keeps trying to come in and she even comments, but nobody pays any attention to her ever. I've never seen her here. So I don't know if she's just not showing up or if she's invisible or what. So anyway, where I was going with that whole story was just saying, I'm tired of talking politics today. And I just reviewed that. I found pictures of my great grandfather who was murdered, and he was wearing a hat something like this one, and he was a studio shot, and he had on his dapper fedora and wasn't quite as tall in the crown as this one. In a nice suit, he's tall and lean and muscular looking, but yeah, he was wearing his hat, and so it was neat to find an old shot like that, because of course I like wearing my penman hats, but um, that it was the result of him getting into a political discussion with somebody that apparently they, who knows that kind of thing is going to happen. And this guy was apparently, from what I read between the lines, this was a normal occurrence that they all did. They'd all sit down there and hang out and talk. That's what they did. And what I found was that this was election day. Now, I don't know who voted for what, but was something about the guy that shot my great grandfather, said something about, he was talking about the goddamn Republicans and you goddamn Republicans or something. So apparently, my great grandfather was a Republican, from the sounds of it. So you voted with blood back then, ain't that the truth? Truth, Teresa, truth. That's the truth. And thanks, Kay. Nice to see you here, KT Emma. Glad you made it out. And again, hopefully my voice holds out tonight. It's been slowly but surely coming back, but then it goes croaky all of a sudden, all on its own. So talk to the doc. I get the same thing. I've had the same thing almost every year of my adult life. It just seems there's one period of time when my voice just goes, and I get all coffee, and my little kids have got a little bit of the dry cough and all that. Even though it's winter's long over, it's hot and humid here now. It's like subtropical out here today. That's the misnomer about Minnesota and Wisconsin, though, folks. Is that we are Arctic tundra year around. We've got the flip flop in the summer. It's going to be, I think, close to 100 degrees here this weekend. Really high dew points and humidities, although the sun will be shining. So it's going to be that hazy, lazy, humid summer days this weekend. Try pineapple juice. Now, I haven't heard that one, Jennifer. I'll have to do that. And mindset, says Kay. Good to have you here with your mindset. I'm not sure what you're referring to there exactly, but somewhere in that, Republicans were true Americans, loving liberals at that time. True America loving liberals at the time. Republicans, they were, politics has always been a hot point all through history. But it just seems that this cycle here in America that we're going through now, hotter than normal, at least since I was in an adult and voting. The first time I could vote, I voted for Ronald Reagan. 1980 was the first time I could vote legally as an adult, and I voted for him for 2 terms. And so I was a Republican back then. I'm not a Republican now. I say I'm an independent, but if you've listened to Rocky and I talk, I say that I'm. People say, "Well, you're just a Republican," because I tend to be more conservative and right, with the capital R, on my political viewpoints. I'm no right wing nut, to be sure, although I've been called that. But I'm to the right and I'm conservative. And I tell people I'm not a Republican, but I am a small C conservative with a libertarian bent. I'm a constitutionalist. I'm a constitutional in its original intent. And I know intent is hard to interpret, so you have to do a lot of study. And so you could really say I'm almost a Jeffersonian liberal, which is fairly conservative. So that's kind of where I come down on things. And Scott is Dowers is just a wingnut. It's good to hear. So anyway, thank you once again for all being here. Why don't we get started? Now, I thought I'd give it a little time, a few minutes for everybody to get here, and we'll get all caught up. And since I am topicless until we get to King David tonight, I could just ramble on. I could ramble on forever. That's, like I say, put a nickel in me and I'll talk for 4 hours. Wolf, I could find a topic and we could just go off, but let me just kind of bring it down now. Now we've got the introduction out of the way. Once again, here I am, home alone for the weekend. Family is all gone and out doing their thing. It's nice to have some tranquil moments. I love my children, love my wife, but sometimes it's damn nice to be alone, have it a little quiet, get your thoughts put back together. I feel a little sorry for her, my wife, in that she's not. I told her, if you want to leave the kids and just go up by yourself and have a nice weekend, why don't you do that? And now she wanted the kids. The kids wanted to go. So my little kids hugged me like they were taking a trip to Europe for the next month or something. So they all took off, and it was nice to see them off a few hours ago. So you get to wear your kilt with no reservations. That is the truth, Delaney. And yeah, I can walk around the house buck T, as they say. And I like my kilt, so I'd wear my kilt all the time. So liar, liar, pants on fire. I got to find this for Donald Trump. I'm not sure. I got to get back into the context of what's going on up there. Kay says liar, liar, pants on fire. Hotter than normal, symptom of a big change in the air, manifesting great change for America and the UK, says Jennifer. And Kay, I'm not sure if you were talking to me or not. I'd have to dig back into the comments. Not really. And you said lie. I hope I'm not lying. I hope you didn't think I'm lying about something. Let's see. I got a bumpy fondness for Donald Trumpy Bumpy, says Delaney. Jeremy says like and share. I agree with Jeremy. And Kay says fake news. Bye. And not sure, Kay, where you are, where what you're referring to there. If you want to clarify, you certainly can. I'm Jeffersonian. Center toward the right, says Jeannie. I've got an antipathy for Trump, but I'll give him props for not stepping to Iran. By the way, hello all, says Wolf Weaver. Good to see you, Wolf. And let's see. And that's where the kilt comment came in. And Jennifer says, I can't remember the last time she had the lovely alone time. Like I say, my wife gets a little overworked because she's the one that is constantly with the kids while I'm working. I work here at home, so I'm always here, but she always has the brunt of it. Scott Dowers, I am wearing no pants. So I thought I'd let you know. Here, want to see? Look. But all right, here we go. Already liked. Good to see you, Wolf. And I can certainly identify with your beliefs, buddy, says Susie. Scott says, no, not that, no. So, yes, I respect the office too, Susie. All right, here we go. King David is here. You, says King David. Good to have you here, King David. We're talking about your story. So here we go. I'm going to just kind of pick up where we left off. Remember, we were talking about King David and how he, if you see me looking down, I've got all my notes down here on the computer rather than cue cards or a teleprompter. And we were talking about David and how he has declared himself the king of Judah. And he's kind of taking things over. And for those of you who haven't been here or haven't seen everything we've been talking about, I'll just do one quick recap, and that is David was always a hero for me of the faith. When I was in the Christian faith, when I went to Bible college and seminary, I had certain characters of the Bible I related to, and David was one of them. He seemed like such a real person, the guy who was down to earth. He was the sweet psalmist of Israel. He liked music. He played musical instruments. He wrote psalms and songs. He was the man who pursued after God's own heart. He was the giant slayer. It says that David slew the giant, and this is how we all knew who he was. And of course, the giant, not in mythic proportions, but in really right at the edge of believable proportions. Goliath being a big guy. And the Bible calls him one of the Nephilim. and the sons of Anak, and so on. And so we know these familiar stories of David. And David was always this guy that you saw doing things that would have been really kind of bad things, but he was always the guy who came back and made up for it, or he wrote about that. And uh, he tried to make up for things. And there were so many things you read about David that he supposedly wrote that you felt that you knew who this man was. If if you grew up in church or Sunday school or things like that, and you were familiar with these stories. And of course, you think of the Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And so on. And that psalm, I once had it fully memorized when I was a kid. That's the stuff that's attributed to David. David, after the sin with Bathsheba, as we know, where he has adultery with the wife of the captain, one of his captains in his army, and he tries to get the captain to go home and have sex with his wife. Go home, lay with your wife. The war's going on. Take a little break. And the guy's so loyal to David, according to the story, he won't do that. And so David sends him back to the front, and he tells his general, pull back from him in the front. I want to see him killed in battle. And so this is found out. David is called the murderer, the adulterer. What does he go and write? He writes that Psalm 52. If you read that, where he's begging forgiveness of God. And he says those famous lines in there: purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. And you could just feel the anguish of heart. And so all these things were things that I grew up with, things that made me, in a sense, idolize this character as somebody to look up to. And then what happens? You go along and you start studying more, you start researching more, you start finding that the big turning point for me was realizing that a lot of the Bible as I knew it wasn't exactly what I thought it was on the surface. And once you started studying and researching and digging a little deeper, you find that the faith element that you bring to those stories in that book are just from inside. It's what you attribute to them. And uh, I was tired of being told what to believe about it. I wanted to know why I believed what I believed. And the more I dug, the more I found that I had certain problems with the way things were written. And especially, and here's the crux of the recap, the story of David, finding out that David, most of this story as we read it in the Bible, in the book of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, those stories are comprised, the men who authored them, it's an apologetic about David. And the earmarks of the apology are so crystal clear. And by the way, I don't doubt for a minute that David really existed as a real guy, because you don't write an apology for somebody that doesn't exist. You can't apologize and try to make the deeds look better of somebody that wasn't real. And so, like in this book that I read that gave me a lot of animus, I read this book a few years ago by Joel Baden called The Historical David, the real life story of an invented hero. And it's a very clever title. It's the real story of an invented hero. And that's who David is, because we found that most of his deeds, you can look back in and find, while the whole story overall really happened, and the events probably really took place, there are many fictional events laid on top of by apologetic events made to make David look better than he was. And so now we followed his story all the way up. Yeah, Wolf, yeah, he was a real guy that a whole lot of stuff got made up about. Even the story of David and Goliath. Just recap this for a second. That's the famous story of David. David, the young man who, with a stone and a sling, kills the giant Goliath from the opposing army that's terrorizing their army. And it was just a champion. It wasn't like he was out scouring the landscape or anything. He was just one of the soldiers that was the champion. And he happened to be 6 cubits in a span, as the biblical account says, which is anywhere from 8 to 9 feet, somewhere in that height. So he was a big dude. And I don't think he suffered from giantism or anything like that. It just says he was a big guy. But there's a description given about him. It gives his height. Goliath, he's from Gath, so he's what they call a Gittite. And Goliath, a Gittite, or Goliath of Gath. And his spear was like a weaver's pole, if you think of a weaver's beam, and which meant it was gargantuan and weighed a lot. And that's one of the descriptions. Now, there's a description from in the next book over, Second Samuel, that talks about David's mighty men of valor, and it's listing a bunch of these guys that worked for David, that were his soldiers, and their mighty deeds. And in there somewhere, it lists Elhanan, the Bethlehemite, who slew Goliath the Gittite, whose spear was like a weaver's weaver's pole. And it's the same description given. And the way you look at this is you have to say, would David be stealing the story of a lesser person? Would a lesser unknown person, never mentioned anywhere else in the scripture, be stealing the story of David to make himself look better? And it comes up in a list of all the deeds of David's mighty men. And some of the other men slew Goliath's brothers. And in the English Bible, when you read that account, it shows in italics, it says the brother of. It says, so Elhanan, the Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath the Gittite, whose spear was like a weaver's shaft or pole. But the brother of is added in for clarity. It's in parentheses in the English version. You go to the Hebrew and it's not there. It's Goliath. So you start looking at events like that and you say, was he the actual slayer of the giant? Or did he become known as the slayer of the giant because it was one of his guys that killed him? But the apologists wrote that he did it to make his deeds look better. Now, David, no doubt, was a mighty warrior. He did a lot of fighting in his days, and he was a rough and tumble character, but he would be more like your mercenary. He would be more somebody who they bolstered his deeds as opposed to what he did do, but he did fight for King Saul. He was a general or a captain in Saul's armies. And the big turning point was when he runs away from Saul because Saul's trying to kill him. We find out later from one little slip of the scribal entry. Later in the story, it talks about David marrying Abigail, the wife of Nabal, who we talked about, and that he already had his wife, Ahinoam, who also he had a son by her. Well, Ahinoam, the only other place we see her in the scripture, she's Saul's wife, the king of Israel's wife. So David, in all these events where it writes it as if he's not really looking to take over as king, anointed king by the prophet, all these different things, all his mighty deeds, all the time Saul's trying to kill him and he doesn't understand why. It's because Saul's jealous because he knows David's anointed in his place, the story tells us. And we come to find out, though, that David did the uncommittable sin, and he had adultery. He committed adultery with the king's wife and stole the king's wife to try to increase his claim, to try to get to the throne. And when you did that in ancient times, you were showing that the king was weak. The king could not even defend his own family. So this was very important. And the penalty for that was not usually a slap on the wrist. The penalty for that was pretty nasty death. And so this is what was going on. And David is now, after wandering in the wilderness for years, running from Saul, became a mercenary, for the Philistines, he basically was no longer an Israelite or a Judahite. He was now fighting for the king of Philistia, Achish. And he was even given a town, and he's raiding on the southern border of Judah. But then when Saul dies, which we find out he has a hand in, we're not going to recap all those events. We find that now David is king. He's claimed kingship of Judah, but by not because the people wanted him, but because he pushed his way in, had the power to do it, now had an army to back him up. And now he's trying to also gain the kingship of Israel in the south. I'm sorry, he's Judah in the south, Israel in the north. And this is what became the divided kingdom again later after a couple of generations. So David is trying to coalesce this all under his command. And what we do know is that after Saul's death on Mount Gilboa, Saul and his son Jonathan, the prince, who the story in the Bible says was David's closest friend, there was a love there that was closer than brothers. This was his friend who warned him, and he left and ran from Saul. Both Saul and his son and a couple of his other sons were killed at Mount Gilboa, the battle there with the Philistines. And at this time, David is still on the run, but it became very clear that David more than likely was the one who led part of the battle against King Saul, even though the apologetic in the Bible finds a way to get him out of the scene for something that never actually happened. Remember, it says that the king Achish sent him home, didn't want him fighting in the battle against Saul. But David, honorable, and he went back home, takes his men with him, his 300 men. And it says they get back home and they find that they've been raided by the Amalekites, and David chases them all down while the battle is going on over on Mount Gilboa. David's chasing down the Amalekites who've raided his town, taken his wife, his family, his son, and everything there, taken all their spoils. David catches up with them, and miraculously, no one's hurt. No one's raped. No one's pillaged. Not a thing is out of place. Not a hair is out of place. David kills the Amalekites and rescues his family and the whole village. They bring him back home to Ziklag. And the problem here is that would be a first if that had happened. So again, this is an apologetic. It's probably a fictionalized account to cover David's ass. So now, all of that getting caught up, here's this guy that you have all this wonderful story about that you grew up with sometimes. And for me, when I started learning all of this and finding out this is so, David's not who the biblical story said he is. There's this wonderful, beautiful, glossy, apologetic, fictional tale about David placed on top of the real person. And it was a little disillusioning at the time. Discouraging a little bit. But at the same time, the only discouraging thing was it affected my faith. I said, these are the things I put my faith in. Then I come to find if this story's not true and all of this is apologetic, what else is apologetic? And that's how things start to unravel over the last several years for me, the last 10 years. And so we're looking at this story now. Now we're at that point. David, Saul's dead. He's putting together his power in Judah, wants to try to get the power in Israel. Now Saul's general, Abner, who is still alive, puts Saul's final remaining son, Ish-bosheth, Ishbal, on the throne of Israel. And this is kind of where we left off last night. And so here what's going on. And this there was military confrontation that had been going on between David and Israel. And now that Ish-bosheth is on the throne. And this is inevitable. It took place at Gibeon, a town near the southern border of Israel. And given the location, it's really likely that Abner, the general, Saul's old general, who was the kingmaker, put Saul's son Ish-bosheth on the Israelite throne, that Abner led all the Israelite troops to Gibeon as a defense measure, and that David's men, led by his general Joab, David's general, saw this as an opportunity to engage in combat without going too far north. And the Bible presents this battle at Gibeon as a rout with Joab, David's general, and David's men pursuing Abner until the last light of day. And with the sun setting, Joab gave up the chase. He allowed Abner to retreat and return to Hebron. And this much seems like it's pretty likely that that's the way this account took place. But not quite so believable are more of the stories that are embedded into the biblical account of this battle. The first is this bizarre moment right at the beginning of the fighting when Abner and Joab are supposed to have selected 12 men from each side to engage in single combat. It's kind of the same thing Goliath was trying to do with the Israelite forces. Send me out a champion. Well, they each chose 12. And it was almost for the entertainment of all the troops that they did this. And each pair is said to have simultaneously stabbed each other so that they fell together. A quote. That's a quote from the scripture. They all fell together. And from both the set piece feel of the story and the fact that it has no effect on the rest of the narrative, it starts to really become obvious as you're reading this and looking through the words that the story is nothing but an elaborate etiology for a place in Gibeon called the Field of Blades. And so it's a fictionalization. It's how they named the site, the Field of Blades. And the second story is again of single combat, but of a different kind. David's leading warriors, the sons of Zeruiah, Joab his general, Abishai and Asahel, are said to have been present at the battle. Asahel, according to the text, set off on a run after Abner, who is Israel's general, Ish-bosheth's general, such that the two of them were essentially alone, streaking through the field. Abner begs Asahel to stop chasing me. Stop, he says, warning that if he didn't relent, Abner would turn and have to fight him and would probably kill him. Asahel refused. So Abner, left with no choice, he struck him in the belly with a backward thrust of his spear. Oh, one of those you see in the movies. Oh, and with a backward thrust of his spear, and he kills Asahel on the spot. This is in 2 Samuel 2. And not only is this sort of single combat story more literally than likely a reminiscent of kind of like the Homer tales, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the episode exists entirely as a means for establishing for future use some rationale for why Abner needs to die. The General Abner needs to be killed. There's some blood revenge on him now. And this blood vengeance for the death of Asahel, interestingly enough, though, the other parts of this trio, Joab and Abishai, are regular figures in the David story. Asahel is never, ever mentioned anywhere else before this episode. And it's not that he was invented necessarily. In fact, he is listed as one of David's elite warriors in 2 Samuel 23, well after he's supposed to have died at Gibeon. But his relationship to Joab and Abishai does seem to a new creation of the biblical authors. Again, just to justify the impending death of Abner. Abner's got to die, and so they create a reason in the biblical story why he has to die from this obscure character who's mentioned elsewhere once. And now this battle between David and Israel ended without a decisive victory, as most battles did. Now keep in mind, we're talking about the battle between David and Israel. David is not an Israelite right now. The Bible is maintaining its story that David is this righteous man, and all this is happening because God has anointed him to be the next king. But the whole apologetic is pointing to the fact that this is fictional and that David really worked himself out of his own country, and now he's trying to come back in and fill the void and take over as king, which is what his original intent was. And his military forces proved their strength in driving Abner and his men away from Gibeon. And though they seem not to have had the resources to capture any of the Israelite territory, This is the only battle between the two sides recorded in the whole Bible, between David and the forces of Israel. And we're told after this only that the war between the house of Saul and the house of David kept growing weaker. And that's in 2 Samuel 3. And the battle at Gibeon thus has to be taken as representative of the war as a whole. Nothing decisive, but a clear advantage to David's side. And this is to be expected, since Abner's army was probably significantly diminished after the defeat of Saul. And David's army substantially stronger, both by controlling all of Judah and by virtue of Philistine support. David's the strong arm here. And but he's not satisfied with just being the king, really self-made king by force of Judah. He wants Israel as well. He wants to unify this. After all, there may have been some pull in David's heart. This is his homeland. Even though he had worked himself out of being an Israelite and he's working for the Philistines, now he wants to be the king. This is something he's been pursuing. And maybe he was actually anointed in his youth or told that he would be the next king. Almost like a Macbeth being told by the witches in the way that he would be the next king. He'd be the Thane of Cawdor and so on. And so he works himself into his own demise. So at the same time, it made Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who's put on the throne by the general Abner after the death of Saul and his sons. This is the youngest son, is put on the throne, and it makes him weaker and weaker. And David just keeps kind of chiseling away and growing stronger while the armies of Israel grow weaker and weaker. And eventually the power dynamic in the north in Israel is going to become is going to come to a head. And it's got unpleasant consequences for both the king and his master. And you're going to see what goes on here. Now, we're going to get into this section now, the betrayal of Abner. This is all of this stuff. It sounds academic, but this is all here for the purpose of really building the story as to why things happened the way they happened in this story. I want to say hello to Melinda. Good to see you. Nice to have you here. Sorry you're late again. That's okay. I was a couple minutes late myself. So don't tell anybody. Don't tell Rocky and Jeff. They like to think I'm late all the time. So Wolf says, hate politics. Had to avoid it for my mental health. It's a crap show. Ain't that the truth, Wolf? I get into good discussion about politics. Once politics becomes messy and people don't want to dialogue, play nice with you, they call you names, it's all of this. Not that I have a thin skin. I can take, sticks and stones may break my bones, dumbass, would be my response. I just get tired of it. I am so tired of it. Anyway, I'm right there with you. So, Rocky Stucci's in the room. Hey, how was your ice bath there, Rocky? I hope it was good. And Rocky, sometimes he warms up the same cup twice in the microwave. Cannoli uses a lot of words, forgets he has a cup of mud in the front of him. Hey, Rocky, can you see something? There's something in my eye. Can you catch that? I don't know where it is. Is it over here? Maybe it's on this side. You see it, Rocky? Anyway, yeah, sometimes I'll sit here and I'm doing radio for so long, my coffee gets cold. And rather than brew another cup, I just put it in the microwave, I warm it up. So what? Rocky, shut up. There, I just pulled a Rocky. Although I'm probably not as good at it as he is. He's more intimidating than I am. So, Rocky, good to have you here. Klaatu asked me, Scotty, you believe all this that you speak? I can tell you this, Klaatu, 09 Klaatu. Klaatu Barada Nikto. If that's probably where your name came from, I don't know. You probably know what that reference is. Do I believe all of this stuff? I don't think it's a thing of belief. To me, belief is a thing of faith. You put your heart into something, your faith into something, you believe it. To me, facts are facts, knowledge is knowledge, belief is belief. Belief is what you wrap around things. When I look at these stories and I look at the apologetics, I look at the way it's structured. I've got to look at literary facts, historical facts, and say, this is believable because of this, this, and this. What I do find true is that these stories seem to ring true because they fit into, I guess, an anthropological study and not so much archaeological, but historical study, a literary study. You look at the history of the times that these things were going on and you compare them to frankly, there are other apologetics of other kings that were not part of the Hebrew religion or the Israelite nation, but they were kings of the times and of the day in those ancient times. They've got their own apologetics in other countries, and some of the same literary vehicles are used. So, yeah, I would say, um, what did Jeremy just say? There's the intellectual energy that smacks you in the face. Well, that's kind of it. That's the same thing that I get. So Rocky says, yes, he believes it. So Rocky will tell me I talk too much. He said, yeah, if I'd have been asked that question, he'd go, yeah, and he'd move on. So anyway, yeah, Klaatu, I do believe it, but I have to give a complete answer to you. There's a rationale as to why I believe what I'm saying. I believe some of the things also that I'm talking about, some of them could be speculative. And I mention where I believe they are. We can speculate that it happened this way. All we know for sure is that it most probably didn't happen the way it's written, because due to many different factors. So here, let's. I never talk too much. See, Rocky, Susie says I never talk too much. So there you go. All right, let's move on. Nothing ever happens the way it's written. And, which is too bad. It's even the story of Moses. When I went through that with the Exodus reality, the story of Moses didn't happen the way it was written. But I think that it clarifies the story where some people will say, historians will say, Moses never existed. The Israelites were never slaves in Egypt. I think you can prove that they were. So apologetics, there's no apologetic there. There's just looking at the historical record and seeing if it fits. And it does. So let's move on. Abner, who is the kingmaker. He was Saul's general. He's the one who takes Saul's final son, uh, Ishbal or Ish-bosheth, and puts him on the throne in Israel. And poor Ish-bosheth, poor Ish-bosheth. Who's he got to contend with? While his army is growing weaker and weaker and weaker, he's got to deal with David, who is not only been building his power base in Judah for the last few years, but is also now a vassal king, if you will, a vassal ruler of their enemies, the Philistines. And he's now the king of Israel or of Judah. And he's going to absorb Israel back into him. And everybody seems to have seen where all of this was heading. Ishbal, Ish-bosheth, Ishbal is easy to say. He was stuck. He was the king of Israel. And like any good captain, he had to go down with the ship. But not so with his general, Abner. Abner, who put him in place. Abner, who had the military power, such as it was left after the death of Saul, put him in place. And the biblical story of how Abner broke with Ishbal is kind of a strange tale. Ishbal accuses, and now, Klaatu, you asked me a question on what I believe. Just listen to some of these events and listen to how they play out compared to how the Bible records them. Ishbal accuses Abner of having slept with one of Saul's concubines. So, Ishbal, the king, goes to the kingmaker, his dad's general, and now his general, and says, hey, you slept with one of my dad's concubines. And I got to tell you something, folks. I don't care what the whole tradition with being a king was. If I became the king, I don't want to inherit my dad's harem. Because my dad was doing all those chicks, so to speak. Is that where I want to go? No, not necessarily. Although we know stranger things have happened in history. So it seems like a trivial matter, but in fact, it's one that has this just like David and Ahinoam, the wife of Saul, who he slept with. There's significant symbolic import. And for Abner to sleep with one of Saul's concubines was as good as Abner declaring himself king in those times. Makes no sense today in modern politics. That's the way it worked 3,000 years ago in the Middle East with these royal families. And Abner's response to Ishbal's accusation is equivocal. He castigates Ishbal for doubting his loyalty to Saul's family and kingdom, yet doesn't quite deny the charge. Oh, how dare you? I would never. I'm loyal. So it's like the denial that's not a denial. What? You think I slept with your dad's concubine? I would never. I'm loyal. He doesn't come right out and say I didn't do it. But Abner's anger it leads him to change sides. So here he set up Ishbal, the son of Saul, as king. But now he's so pissed off at Ishbal that he switches sides to go do for David as Yahweh swore to him, to transfer the kingship from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah. 2 Samuel 3. That the dialogue, excuse me for coughing, just pretend we're all having a conversation, sitting by the fire in the living room, and I coughed. That the dialogue between Ishbal and Abner is not historically accurate is proved by the reference to God's promise to make David king, which Abner could not have known about. And some have even argued that the entire episode is an invention, simply a mechanism for explaining Abner's disloyalty. Now, you see, Klaatu and others, this is how you can start to pick this stuff apart, little tiny bit by little tiny bit. Abner wouldn't have known that detail, yet he repeats it. So somebody literally entered that into the text, which tells you the text has been messed with. It's an apologetic to make something look different than it was and make the main character look better, David. So that this dialogue between Ishbal and Abner is not historically accurate is proved by the reference to God's promise to make David king, which Abner could not have known. And some have argued that the entire episode's an invention. Yet it seems really a strange story to invent out of nothing. Given all the possible ways for the break between Abner and Ishbal to have happened, this accusation and non-denial of the charge, complete with details of the concubine's name even, is not the most obvious. Thus, while we can set aside Abner's speech as this literary construction, the episode may well have a historical basis. Abner was, after all, the real power in Israel. He put Ishbal on the throne. It wasn't Ishbal who raised him to power. He also may have been testing Ishbal's resilience. Would the young king have the courage to oppose him? Now that's speculation. But as it turned out, the answer was no. After leveling the charge, Ishbal could say, quote, it's right, quote out of the story, Ishbal could say nothing more in reply to Abner because he was afraid of him. And all of this would have been reasonable preparation for Abner's next step, which was an absolute all-out full betrayal of Ishbal. Abner sends this message now to David. And he says, David, look, I know I put Saul's son on the throne. I was establishing him in his own kingdom in Israel. You're the king in Judah. I tell you what, make a covenant with me, make a pact with me, and I'll lend my hand to bring all Israel over to your side. And the Bible gives us no details of what this covenant might have been, but we can reasonably conjecture what was contained in the covenant like this. Abner would not have simply given up his power for nothing. It seems likely that he would have supported David's nominal kingship in the north, but with himself as a lesser king, like a vassal king. This is kind of what David was in Judah to the Philistines. He was ruling over Israel just as David was a vassal king of the Philistines ruling over Judah. And Abner would maintain his power in the north while preventing any further military advances by David. With the war going badly for Abner against David, it wasn't much of a war. They were just pressing, and Abner was getting weaker and weaker. Israel was getting weaker and weaker. This would have been a prudent move to make. Now, take note of something here, that in sending this message, Abner has taken on the role of the king. He doesn't have Ishbal, so he's doing this himself. He's making himself more powerful than Ishbal in this negotiation with David, even without the official title. He feels himself empowered to present Israel on a platter to David. He put Ishbal on the throne, but he can take him down in a snap of a finger, I think. And it seems quite possible that Abner's dalliance with Saul's concubine was his way of establishing that authority, at least in his own eyes, really in the same way that David started doing it with Ahinoam years earlier. So even without the specifics, David would have recognized Abner's overture immediately for what it was. Across the ancient Near East, a population on the verge of being conquered commonly relinquished its independence to maintain some internal stability. This was normal in that part of the world in those days. If you knew you were going to get sewn under, rather than get killed and everybody killed along with you, make a deal. And so, given the options of putting up a fight, risking wholesale destruction of everything and everyone, and he would take on one hand the yoke of vassaldom, and on the other, which frequently meant only paying regular tribute and providing troops for military actions. The choice was a pretty easy one, I think, for Abner. And for the conquering nation, such a deal. Look, I get the whole thing, and I didn't have to fight for it. So such a deal. And it would spare the significant expense of this full-fledged military preparations and war. And for much of their history, both before and after David, Canaan and Israel took this subservient role, being vassals of the Egyptians during the 2nd millennium BCE, of the Assyrians during the 8th to 7th centuries BCE, of the Egyptians and the Babylonians during the 7th to 6th centuries BCE, the Persians during the 6th to the 4th centuries, the Greeks during the 4th to the 2nd century, and finally the Romans beginning in the 1st century BCE, culminating with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, or CE if you prefer, the Common Era. The periods of Israelite independence were the exception, not the rule, and usually coincided with the decline of the previously dominant foreign empire. So you see all these empires that came in and kept taking over this strategic piece of land. Look at where Israel is today, and look at all the nations around it today. Look at all the conflict that is still there today. Israel was always this focal point of whatever major power around them could defeat them and take them over. And right now, today in Israel, they're pretty strong. They would be at like a Davidic point, Solomonic point, if you were to make a comparison to ancient history. They're on top of their game over there right now with all the countries surrounding them. Revolts against the foreign overlords were occasionally successful, as with the Maccabees, the Maccabean revolt, if you remember that. I got to take a little side trip here on the Maccabees. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the Maccabees. That story is about 100 years before the time of Christ, 100 to 150. The Maccabees revolted against the Greeks who were there, and they drove them out of Israel. And it was Judas Maccabeus, or Judas the Hammer, he was known as, was the lead of this family, the Maccabees, who drove the Greeks out. They made a pact with the Romans, and the Romans came in. It's the same kind of pact probably that Abner's working on here. You leave us a little bit of rule here, and you come in and you help us out, we'll help you. And so there was something very interesting that ties into the story of Jesus. If you look in the New Testament, you remember what's been referred to, especially at Easter time in current day, around Easter time in church, they have Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday is when you get all the little kids in Sunday school. They come in, they all have palm fronds, the big palm frond industry in April. And we're, Hosanna to the King, and all of this. This was the triumphal entry, as it's referred to in the New Testament, where Jesus sits, they put him on the foal of a donkey, and they ride him in, and all the people gather around as he enters Jerusalem. It's about 5 days before he's crucified. Enters into Jerusalem, and the whole town is all up. It's Passover time. They're all waving palm fronds and yelling Hosanna to the King of Kings. They're saying to Jesus as he rides into town. Now, if you remember this story, we think that this is this glorious thing, these palm fronds and all of that. What you don't know until you study a little history is that the palm frond was the symbol of the Maccabean family and the Maccabean revolt, which took place 100 plus years earlier. And when they had Jesus riding in on the foal of a donkey, all the hubbub about him, he was the next Judas Maccabee. He is going to be the hammer of Israel. He is going to remove us from the bondage to Rome. And so when Jesus rode in, they're all waving the palm fronds. This is like waving, I don't know, it'd be like waving the American eagle symbol. Think of a symbol of one of our great heroes in the United States, or in England, or wherever you might be. This is what they were doing. So what the people did when Jesus rode into town, they thought he was going to be the next Judas Maccabee. He was going to come and oust the Romans and lead an army and reestablish a monarchy in Israel. And this is why I had always asked the question, why were all these people praising Jesus and calling him king, waving the palm fronds, and 4 days later, they're all calling for him to be crucified in front of Pilate, the governor? Why? What the change was this? Jesus didn't fulfill their expectations. He wasn't what he said. Look, my kingdom isn't of this earth. My kingdom is of heaven. It's in your heart. And they're all like, that's not what we were. That's not what we wanted. Palm fronds all got dropped on the ground. The symbol of the Maccabean revolt was gone. So this is really what you're getting here, is that all of this stuff, there's this buildup, and there's this covenant that Abner wants to make. There's all this preparation for war that they're avoiding now because of Abner's thing. And there's this symbol of, and I really got off onto a side story on that. I'm trying to segue it back into where I left off. These revolts against the foreign overlords were sometimes successful, as like with the Maccabees, whom the people thought Jesus was emulating. But it usually ended in defeat still. And this was the case with the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE, as was the case with the destruction of the southern kingdom in 586 BCE. So David, and which were all two to 400 years after the time of David. So David would have received Abner's message. So pardon my rabbit trail into history. I always find that a fascinating story. I wanted to go there when I saw a reference here to that I make to the Maccabees. So David would have received Abner's message in this light. He would have known that Abner was offering himself as a vassal, hoping to avoid further military conflict and willing to recognize David's power and perhaps maintain some of his own up there in Israel in the north. And even if to a limited capacity, at least he's got life, he's got riches, he's got the palace. So such as it is, he's ruling, he's in power, kind of. And David's response was positive, but it came with this interesting condition. David said to Abner, he said, "Come before me in person and bring along Michal, Saul's daughter." And you remember her? David's married to her. This was one of the conditions that was met when David slew Goliath, when David became the warrior in the apologetic story, but that Michal becomes his wife, the king's daughter. Saul was reluctant to do this because David's already trying to claim his throne. And so then he's married to her. Remember, Saul tries to kill David by breaking in, and Michal helped him helped him escape. But we've already discussed the probability that the story of David marrying Michal while he was still in Saul's service, it might have been fictional. And this moment, however, seems eminently possible. He's saying, bring Michal. And whether they were married in the past or not, David's summons of Michal is a highly charged symbolic gesture. He's establishing his kinship right to Saul's throne. As son-in-law of the deceased king, David is removing this avenue of objection from the north and simultaneously following the established ancient tradition of using royal marriage for diplomatic ends. So he's probably already married to her. And now, however, the marriage is truly between two royal houses, for David's now acknowledged as the king in Judah. And the marriage to Michal consummates the joining of the two houses into one, with David as its head. David, the king of Judah, marrying the daughter of the dead king of Israel. Now, if, however, David was in fact not married to Michal previously, then this is more than mere diplomacy. It's yet another demonstration of David's incontrovertible power in the north. He felt himself strong enough to demand that Saul's daughter be stripped from her rightful husband, who's portrayed pathetically as weeping while following her out of the house. So either she's leaving him for David, who she's already married to, or she's leaving him on Saul, and the guy's weeping. Don't go. I don't know what the situation is. Maybe it's not as something that can be mocked as easily as we want to, but maybe he's weeping for good charge. But the biblical story is trying to show him as powerless and therefore weeping when she leaves. And evidently he was right. Even more interesting, David made his demand not only of Abner, but also of Ish-bosheth. In some ways, this was more logical avenue, since Ish-bosheth was the king, at least nominally. And more important was Michal's brother. That's who Ish-bosheth is. And so in the end, according to the Bible, it was Ish-bosheth, the king of Israel, placed on the throne by Abner, the son of Saul, sends his sister Michal off to David. And this would have had to have political significance. The king on the throne is sending his sister off to the king that wants his throne. And though Abner was the one who approached David to relinquish the rights to the Israelite throne, Ish-bosheth, in sending Michal, signaled his complicity in the decision. And in the end, what choice did he have? His general had just offered to turn his nation over to David. Thanks, dude. Thanks for putting me on the throne, then turning my nation over to David and saying that you're going to take the throne. He couldn't do anything to stop it. And denying Michal to David would have been really inviting military retribution at that moment. Now, when you look at these things that David is doing, yet the Bible still calls him a man after God's own heart. Sweet psalmist of Israel. Yet you see, he is just as deliberately not good. He's following tradition of his day, but this is what you did. He didn't break with tradition of the day. He didn't become a standout for God, so to speak. He was doing what he needed to do to gain his own power, and nothing could stop him. And the defection of Abner meant practical dissolution of Ishbal's kingdom. Perhaps man of shame, which is what his name is here, is an appropriate name for him after all. Ishbal, Ish-bosheth. And when Abner arrived in person before David, the meeting seems to have been relatively brief, and in part, it's because the visit was mostly symbolic. The subjugated vassal presenting himself before his new overlord, presumably bearing some sort of gift, pledging his fealty. However, the meeting was brief also because it came to a rather abrupt end. Abner never made it back to Israel. Oh, surprise, huh? Because Joab, David's general, struck him down and killed him. And the question that both the biblical text and the modern historian need to answer is, why did he do this? Why? Why did David's general strike down Abner, who just made this pact with David? And the Bible, as already mentioned, suggests that Joab kills Abner as revenge for Abner's murder of Joab's brother Asahel, who was never mentioned before that scene. The backward spear thrust, And since, however, it seems that Abner did not really kill Asahel, and even perhaps that Asahel was not really Joab's brother at all, this explanation, we've got to reject it historically. But it ties into the larger theme of the David story that we've already seen over and over and over again. And that's the exoneration of David for the deaths of his enemies. David is always written to be free of guilt in any of this. And this case is a particularly tricky one, however, because the Bible admits that it was David's own general who killed Abner. To deal with this, the Bible gives Joab a personal motivation for the murder, quite apart from any connection with David. And David is portrayed as being appalled. I'm shocked that my general murdered Abner. That at Joab's actions. Here's a quote from the story, may the guilt fall upon the head of Joab and all his father's house. May the house of Joab never be without someone suffering from a discharge or skin disease, or a male who handles the spindle, or one who falls by the sword, or one lacking bread. That's in 2 Samuel 3. And later, those men, the sons of Zuriah, are too savage for me. May Yahweh requite the evildoer for his evil. Speaking of Joab. Yet for all this talk, David takes no action against Joab. He curses him, but takes no action against him. He remains David's commander for the entirety of David's reign, even though David leveled all these curses at him for killing Abner. So, once again, David is painted as being so sparkly clean in this. Yet, with all the cursing and all this, he doesn't discharge Joab from his service. Doesn't kill Joab. So the over-the-top condemnation of Joab is exceeded only by David's own proclamations of innocence. I and my kingdom are forever innocent before Yahweh of shedding the blood of Abner, son of Ner. How about that? That's in 2 Samuel 3:28. And as he did with Saul and Jonathan, David intones a dirge over Abner, the man he'd been fighting against for years. And as with Saul and Jonathan, David puts on this public display of mourning, rending his clothes, wearing the traditional sackcloth and ashes, lamenting, fasting. David even personally walks behind Abner's body as it's taken to be buried, and he weeps aloud by Abner's grave. Weeps aloud for Abner. If all of this weren't enough, the biblical narrators remind us again and again that David had absolutely nothing to do with Abner's death. Well, by the way, with all this stuff we're telling you about David, he didn't have anything to do with his death. That when Abner left David's side, he was absolutely fine. It says, David dismissed Abner, who went away unharmed. Verse 21 of chapter 3. Another quote, Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, for he had been dismissed and had gone away unharmed. In the next verse. Joab was told Abner, son of Ner, had come to the king and was dismissed by him and went away unharmed in the next verse. 3 times in 3 verses. And then that day all the people in Israel knew that it had not been the king's will to kill Abner, the son of Ner, in verse 37 of that chapter. And if all Israel, quote unquote, in the story knew it, then all Israel, the story's audience, is expected to know it too. And so this defense of David, reformulated and reiterated in almost every verse of the narrative, is simply too much. Methinks thou dost protest too much, or establish your case too much, in almost every verse in the narrative. And Abner left David's presence dismissed and unharmed. And David is not guilty of the death of Abner, the son of Ner. So far more likely is it a simple solution that David instructed Joab to kill Abner after Abner left the meeting. So Abner comes to strike this deal to be this vassal ruler under David, turns over Israel, the keys to Israel, to David. Brings Michal, Saul's daughter, for David to even strengthen his ties. What does David do? As soon as Abner leaves, it tells Joab, make sure he never gets back. You're playing on my team, right? Right, Joab? Make sure he doesn't get back. So Abner left the meeting with David, and David let him go so as to avoid any kind of suspicion or tacking this event onto David. And this is the counter narrative that the Bible's trying to defend against. And it's also sensible from David's position. If by this point we've come to accept that David regularly finds murder to be a sensible solution to the problem, whatever problems it had. At first, it doesn't seem like a wise choice on David's part. Wasn't Abner about to turn all of Israel over to David? Isn't this what David wanted in the end? And yet, while David wanted control of the north, he was still smart enough to see that Abner was negotiating from a position of weakness. So David is one of those guys. It's not like he wasn't gracious. You're weak. I'm going to take advantage of your weakness. And after years of war, Abner's overtures signal that the Israelite forces were on this verge of complete defeat. And that's why he came to David. And this was a last-ditch effort, though it was probably the best move that Abner had. David hardly needed or wanted to share power with anybody. So this was all, while Abner humiliates himself or humbles himself before David, David doesn't need it. He doesn't need to share the power. Why would he want to share power? He wanted it all. David was hungry for the power, and he hardly needed to share it with anybody. And tribute and military service are valuable substitutes for warfare when the dominant party is far away and the cost of moving the troops to the conquered territory is high. But David is like right in his backyard. He's close enough that he could enter Israel at a moment's notice and even return to Judah, probably for dinner. Be back home for dinner in his own living room. And as like at the Battle of Gibeon. So in short, Abner couldn't offer anything that David could not take for himself. And what's more, if Abner really was the power in Israel, then David would have recognized that the best way to slay the beast is to cut off its head. And without Abner to lead in Israel, the northern kingdom would be utterly lost, with only the figure puppet of Saul's last son, Ish-bosheth, in place. And Ishbal, by sending Michal, his sister, had already effectively signaled his abdication to the throne. And with Abner's death, there's no more power. You got a guy wearing robes and a crown, sitting on a throne in Israel with no power, and David wanting it. So now comes the death of Ishbal. So you're starting to see, you get this picture when you start going behind the scenes that David's not this nice guy. You are going to conclude by the time that we're done with this, as I concluded, if we knew David now, we wouldn't like the dude. He was probably not a likable bitch at all. And this is the problem that you're seeing with the story presented to us versus the recognizing it as an apologetic. David was gangsta, says Wolf. You're absolutely right about that. And clean as mud. Absolutely. So let's go take a look at what happens to Ishbal next. Ishbal. How would you not like to be Ishbal right now? His general's dead, the guy who had the power. There's no armed forces left. Maybe you've got your bodyguard, maybe not. You got nothing. You're the son of the dead king who had been placed in power by the general who is now dead, sitting on the throne when the other king in the south wants everything you have. And so, in the effect of Abner's death on the north was precisely what David would have anticipated. It says in 2 Samuel 4:1, when the son of Saul heard that, and that's Ishbal, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was terrified. What you gonna do at that point? I got to tell you, if I was in a weak position like that, I'd probably say, time to get out of Dodge. I'm going to go set up shop somewhere else. I can tell you what, you wouldn't find me in my palace in my bed. So, sorry, folks. As you can see, he's still contending, not totally gone. So, the killing of Abner was probably the most terrifying thing Ishbal had ever experienced. For through it, David signaled clearly that he was not interested in concluding this conflict by diplomatic means. David would give no consideration to Ishbal, who'd been willing to relinquish his throne in the name of peace. That option now was clearly off the table. Remember David's promise to Saul? In the fictional account, Saul said when David cut the piece off his robe and stole his spear and all that, and Saul said, just remember my descendants when you go to the throne, when you become the king. David said, I will. Yeah, he remembered them all right. He remembered where they were so he could pin them down and have them killed. And David would give no consideration now to Ishbal. And the option was off the table. Ishbal had rendered himself a non-entity. And he was now about to realize that fate in the most tangible of ways. Without a figure of power at the head of Israel, Abner being dead, Ishbal being ineffectual, any last attempt to save the North would logically come from the remaining national institution, the military. But there was little the military could do, and there was no effective leader of the military. Who are they fighting for? They're fighting for the king, but they're nothing. They've got nothing to give. The military couldn't do anything to spare Israel from being overwhelmed by David's army. Only one path remained and only one option for avoiding the inevitable. And so it should not be a surprise that two of Ishbal's officers, Rechab and Banah, from the tribe of Benjamin, entered Ishbal's house at night, his own guys, and they killed him. And they cut his head off in his bed. And they took it to David with an obsequious message. Here's the head of your enemy, Ishbal, the son of Saul, who sought your life. This day Yahweh has avenged my lord the king upon Saul and his offspring. That's in 2 Samuel 4:8. Here's these two brothers, these unwitting idiots, these patsies in the story, think we're going to do David a favor. We're going to cut off the head of Ishbal. He's probably going to give us gold and land. And now their intentions are clear enough. By killing Ishbal, taking his head to Hebron, where David is, Rechab and Banah would have been presenting the kingdom of Israel to David. Here it is on a platter, and here's the king's head. And they'd perform the dirty work, leaving David free to enter the north without further bloodshed. And by the way, also relieving David from the responsibility of killing Ishbal or ordering his death. Now, the two officers also had personal motives. Say it isn't so. They displayed their loyalty to their new sovereign, and they may have hoped for some preferential treatment as a result. They also have been motivated by their tribal affiliation. The tribe of Benjamin was the territory farthest to the south in the northern kingdom, directly bordering on David's Judah. And if David did decide to engage in a full-out assault on the north, Benjamin would be the first area to bear the brunt of his military. And what's more, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and therefore Ishbal was also. It thus may have been Benjamin's responsibility to take care of the Ishbal problem. Or at least Rechab and Baanah may have thought that David would trust that all of Israel supported the decision only if it was Saul's own tribe that did the deed. You got to think in the terms of those days. Now, unfortunately for Rechab and Baanah, and anybody who ever does anything like this for David in any of this story, they didn't realize the depths of David's concern for appearances. The death of Ishbal was all to David's good, but if it looked as if David had any hand in it, and if he had accepted Ishbal's head as a trophy, won not in battle, but by cowardly subterfuge, having it cut off in his bed at night, the ramifications for public perception would be absolutely unacceptable to a guy like David. Rechab and Baanah died on the spot. David didn't even let him out of his sight after they bring the head in. They're killed, boom, bang, on the spot. They're struck down by David's men. Their bodies are mutilated. They have their hands and their feet cut off, and probably other parts of their body shoved in their mouths, as some of the traditions of those days. And they were publicly displayed, hung on the wall. As to say, as usual, David did not approve of this. Stamp of unapproval, loss of your limbs, bodily mutilation, your penis stuffed in your mouth, and hung on the wall with probably your head cut off too. So this episode should be very familiar by now to the readers of the David story. Its course is almost predictable. You can see this coming a mile away. It's nearly perfect parallel to the story of the Amalekite, who claimed that he was responsible to David for Saul's death. And he was the guy who came along and killed Saul. And then he was killed for it. And David is wiped of blood guilt from this. And indeed, the Bible even refers directly to that earlier episode in this one. Get this, David says, "The man who told me that Saul was dead thought he was bringing me good news. But instead of rewarding him for the news, I seized and I killed him in Ziklag. How much more then when wicked men have killed a blameless man, Ishbal, in his bed, in his own house?" That's 2 Samuel 4. So since we've already seen the story of the Amalekite looks very much like a literary invention, it's very tempting to think that the same thing happened in this case. David was in fact responsible for Ishbal's death, and that this story is a cover-up by the biblical authors. Yet, this story has certain features that suggest it might be more believable than the first one. Unlike the story of the unnamed Amalekite, this narrative of Baanah and Baanah and Rechab killing Ishbal and taking his head, Ishbal's killers are named by name and by tribal affiliation. If the story were invented, then this would be akin to biblical slander. The families of Rechab and Baanah and the entire tribe of Benjamin would be tagged with the guilt of having killed the rightful Israelite king. But there's no obvious justification for such slander. And unlike the case of the Amalekite, Israel's constant enemy and common target for biblical authors. Furthermore, whereas in the story of Saul's death, there seemed to be no good reason for the Amalekite to have gone to David, as David was merely a Philistine vassal at the time. Now that David's king of Judah and embroiled in this lengthy war against Israel, the taking of Ishbal's head to him makes perfect sense. Finally, the motivation of Rechab and Baanah is understandable on every level. Personally, tribally, nationally. They were simply trying to accomplish what Abner had been unable to do. And when we come to this, and mind you, this is what David wants. He wants Ishbal dead. He wanted Abner dead. He wants Israel for his own. But he's also very concerned about appearances. He needs to maintain this view in the eye of his people for his legacy, for history, that he is the man after God's own heart. And he made sure the writers of his story said this. When we come to this story in the biblical text, we read it in light of the earlier narrative of Saul's death. But in fact, we have to do the reverse. This story is the historically accurate one. And the story of the Amalekite is constructed on the basis of the story of Rechab and Baanah. This is a clever move by the biblical authors. Since Ishbal's death doesn't actually appear to have been David's direct responsibility, then by the literary parallel, it's made to appear as if the same is true of the death of Saul. So now we're accustomed to this point, as you can tell in all this story that we're telling and breaking down, to expect that every death that accrues to David's benefit is also to be laid at his feet. Nabal, Saul, Jonathan, Abner, now Ishbal. But though Ishbal's death did benefit David, it also benefited Rechab and Baanah in the northern kingdom they intended to represent. For the murder of Ishbal is precisely the desired effect. David did not have to enter Israel with military force. With the death of Ishbal, David's reign in Israel was assured. And Rechab and Baanah paid for it with their lives, but on a national scale, the price was worth paying. David would have recognized the value of the gift when Ishbal's head was presented to him, but this is one death for which he probably did not bear direct responsibility. And I got to tell you that David, in benefiting from this, still, you would think that David might say to Baanah and Rechab and Baanah, that I'm going to reward you because you really helped keep us from having to go to war to make this final step happen. Here's your reward. But David still has these men put to death. He still had reason for doing what he was doing. Was there in David's heart any acknowledgement that this was God's anointed, you shouldn't have touched him? Or does the rest of the story that we've seen as we've parsed it and dissected it to death here now indicate that this is something that David would do? He's just, was he an honorable man? Do you think David was an honorable man, an honorable king at this point? So you can see, I was just reading some of the comments here. Yeah, YouTube doesn't like things being said. I don't think YouTube would be. You wouldn't think that they'd be too mad about what we're doing here because we're not talking politics. But anyway, let's go on. It's now 10:35. Don't have a show with Rocky tonight, but there's so little of this material left. Let's see if we can get through this tonight for the rest of this. Now we've got David as the king of Israel. And the northern kingdom had no choice now. Its leading power, Abner, was dead by the hand of David. Ishbal was dead by the hand of its own people. The only path was to acquiesce to David's power. And the biblical notice of David's anointing as king of Israel is almost a complete parallel to that of his anointing in Hebron. Remember, all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. David made a covenant with them in Hebron before Yahweh. They anointed David king over Israel. Boom, done. Now we have to imagine the details of this episode to be essentially identical to when he had his earlier anointing in Judah. All the men of Judah came and anointed David. So after the death of Ishbal, David summoned the elders of Israel, in this case, probably all the tribal leaders, to Hebron, where they were made to offer tribute and swear loyalty to their new monarch. And here's David now, the king of Israel and Judah, the unified kingdom of Israel. And with this crucial moment, David achieved something entirely new. The consolidations, a consolidation, not plural, consolidation, singular, of the kingdom of Israel in the north and Judah in the south, which he himself had created out of nothing. And for the first time in history, a single kingdom spanned the length of Israel, from Dan in the north to the Negev desert in the south. And for the first time, Israel was united. They may not have been united in soul, they were united physically under the king. This was a moment of truly world-changing import in the Middle East. Forever, frankly. And the idea of a people in the land of Israel that we find throughout the Bible and beyond, and that's realized to this day in the modern state of Israel, is authentically due to the person of David. And if you think David did not exist, you're wrong. He was an historical king. He was the king that unified this area. He was the king that led Israel. The current state of Israel to be founded were based on the parameters of the kingdom of David as it existed at his time. So this is a moment of world-changing, history-changing import. There can be no denying the extraordinary change that David wrought on the history of Western civilization. But as in the case of Judah, the glory we attribute to this unification hardly would have been felt by those who lived through it. For them, this wasn't unification, it was conquest. They were beaten. And at no point in David's long career on the throne would Israel ever think of it otherwise. There was this passage, it was after the time when David, the story of David and Bathsheba, that he had her husband killed in battle, so on and so forth, that the prophet said to him, God will not take the throne from your hand, but he said, your household will never know peace the rest of your days. And that was the prophecy that was laid on him for his punishment. And that's really what happened the rest of David's life. There was hardly a day of David's life where he was at peace. And his family fell apart on him. We're going to dig into that pretty deep in the upcoming days here. David's family, his own son Absalom, led a revolt against David years later. And we'll see what happens to Absalom, his beloved son. Absalom is the son that I'm not even going to get into it now because I'm just going to start talking about him, but I don't want to get into that yet. Let's finish where we are here with David. So David in his whole long career now that he's won and united the kingdom into one nation, it's never going to be peaceful the rest of his days. He's a warrior and would be a warrior throughout his days. It says that he sought to build the temple of God in Jerusalem. After he conquers Jerusalem, he gets the land, he sets the tabernacle up there. He wants to build the temple, but God, according to the prophet, according to the story, God tells him no. And one of the reasons given is that because David's house is not a house of peace. David's house is a house of war. David is a warrior, all of this stuff. And so David would not have the privilege of building the temple, but that would go to his son Solomon, who had a reign of peace. And David was at anguish over this, supposedly. We'll dig into that more a little later. But now in the current again, there was this other party that recognized David's enthronement over Israel as an act of aggression. Who do you think that's going to be? Who was David the vassal to? Achish, the king of the Philistines. It's one thing for a vassal to rule over a backwater region. It's equally fine for that vassal to cause trouble for the longtime enemy in the north. But when David becomes king over Judah and Israel, uniting them into one nation, he crosses the line from useful mercenary to potential threat. Now he's the king of quite a large territory. And the Philistines weren't real happy with what David did. So when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed the king in Israel, all the Philistines went up in search of David, according to 2 Samuel 5. The sudden reemergence of the Philistines, entirely absent from the scene since David had become the king in Hebron, reinforces the conclusion that David's kingdom of Judah, when he became king in Judah, he was a Philistine vassal. He was a Philistine, ruling a vassal state beneath Philistia. The idea of this resurgent Israel, now even combined with Judah, was impossible for the Philistines to accept, and they were intent on doing something about it. So almost immediately, from the moment David is crowned king of the united Israel and Judah, almost from that very moment, the Philistines are now biting at his ass. And this is going to be the rest of his life. So he gets what he wants. He establishes this, and he leaves an incredible legacy for Israel. But the sword never departs from his house all his days, as the prophecy said. Now, possibly more poetic to put it that way, too, I think. So possibly the Philistines were putting on a show of force to remind David of his obligations to them, to see whether he would treat Israel as a Philistine vassal state as he had Judah. Now, if so, they were going to be disappointed because David met him with force. Quite probably the Philistines were trying to drive a wedge between Judah and Israel, preventing David's access to the north. In this, too, they would fail miserably. But even David knew, having had just taken the throne, that he was in no position to meet the Philistines in the open field. So he returned to his old established ways and retreated into the wilderness. And there he waited for the Philistines in the hills, where their chariots and war machines were more an encumbrance than an advantage. And the Bible reports that David delayed attacking until the Philistines had entered the forest, and until he heard the sounds of marching in the tops of the baka trees. It says in 2 Samuel 5:24. David, in other words, took advantage once again of his knowledge of the rough terrain and his time spent in the wilderness, in the greenwood, on the run from Saul, on the run from the Philistines, fighting then for the Philistines. He was simultaneously declaring for the first time in almost 10 years his independence. He had been a loyal vassal, but his time had come, and with command of both Judah and Israel, he finally had the resources to stand up for himself. And David's victory against the Philistines was, like every other such Israelite victory, defensive. It was a defensive one. He didn't go out seeking them. He was defending Israel from them. And he was able to push them back to their territory, but not do anything more than that. Yet, as always was the case, the mere ability to fend off the Philistines was of major symbolic significance for Israel. David knew what he was doing on this front, both militarily, politically. Even if Israel saw him as a foreign conqueror to their own land because he was a vassal king or a vassal ruler underneath the Philistines, he was still performing the most important role of the monarchy in Israel, and that was keeping his newly acquired kingdom safe from its greatest nemesis. So the people kind of went, okay. But he was nevertheless still a foreign conqueror. And although we think of David as emblematic of Israel, Star of David, and all of that, we have to remember that he was not an Israelite by contemporary definition of the term. He was born and raised in Judah, reigned in Judah, a non-Israelite territory, that two regions spoke basically the same language, though with dialectical differences. They worshiped the same deity, and they didn't make them the same. Judah was not Israel, as Canada is not the United States. David may be identified with Israel today, but he was an outsider, and he ruled only by the imposition of his will on the unwilling north, the northern kingdom. He imposed his will, and that's how he ruled. And now there's a little more to this that I want to get through tonight before we go into the next section. We're going to talk about Saul's descendants that are left over. We're going to talk about Meribal, who's left over, and what happens there. And really, all it comes down to is that David becomes this brilliant, absolutely ruthless tactician. Nothing he did was unexpected. None of what he did was particularly innovative either. He was just simply good at what he did. He attained the throne, removed the threat of Saul's descendants, and was just the beginning of what his life would be now. And now, after this, we're going to just look at what he achieved while he was actually on the throne. How did he create this new kingdom, and how did he create his image? That's going to be David's kingdom. So when we pick up again next week on Monday, we're going to talk about just a little bit of a remnant on this of Saul's descendants, how David wipes the rest of them out, but then how he establishes his kingdom. And it's going to lead into the story of Bathsheba and the affair he has with her. And remember, the child dies as a result. That's the prophet. The prophet comes in and says, God's going to take the life of the child, which he does, according to the text. And the living son, the next son that he has through Bathsheba, is Solomon, who becomes the next king. And there's some interesting stuff about Solomon it's a little hair-raising about this whole account. And some things that really, when I started piecing this together, really grated on me. And we'll get there. We're not going to even talk about it tonight, but it's interesting stuff. So there you go. I want to go back through some of your comments here and see if there's anything pertaining to any of this that we want to hit on. Scott Dower says, I'm keeping him out of trouble. You and talk all night and we could listen every second. There's a second loss on Facebook. Well, I'm glad. Glad you're enjoying it, Scott. I'm glad I'm keeping you out of trouble. Let's see. Wolf says, I'm a gentleman and a scholar. Yeah, there's a lot of depth to this. I appreciate your saying that. I can't take all the credit. I drew a lot of material from others in my research. Drew a lot of material from Joel Baden's book on King David, and I've still got it laying over there in a pile somewhere. I've got the paperback here, but it's all messed up. It's a good book, and I drew material from that. I appreciate your saying that. As most people who do scholarly research and stuff, you're just building, you're putting another apple on the cart. There's a lot of material here. And the sad thing is that it dissembles the character of somebody that we once held so high. At least I know I did. It's mostly because that was my whole life, was the Bible and learning the Bible and teaching it, like Jeff. I don't know. I've never done the math. Jeff says he has over 200,000 hours of Bible study. I'm sure I probably rival him in some respects, although I don't do as much study and research as he does now on biblical texts alone. But having gone to seminary, having been in ministry like Jeff has, I'm only making a comparison to him because we have very similar backgrounds, as many of you know. So I want to make sure I'm presenting stuff. There's still that gnawing in the back of my head that maybe it's all exactly as the text says. Maybe this stuff is all the miraculous working of God in history. The God, Yahweh, Jehovah, made all these things happen the way they happened. But that, my friends, is absolute utter faith and belief in something that probably isn't so. And so finding out there's a bit of faith that gets bolstered in the sense, too, that you find out David was a real guy. You can't just say the guy didn't exist because his story is too fantastic. Because you start going through and you find out, yeah, the story is fantastic because it probably happened a different way. And we find out all this historical information about him. David was probably not a nice guy. I don't know. We may not have wanted to know who he was, really. But he sure had some good writers. He had a good PR firm working for him. So, anyway, let's see. Going back through here, see if there's anybody I missed who came in tonight. Glad to have you all here, by the way. Let's see. Doing odd buffering tonight, says Michelle. Abundant favor to take care of that pesky antitrust issue. That's something different. Let's see. I'm just going through to see if there's anything that stuck out that you had either asked or keeping Scott Dowers out of trouble. We already saw that. David did correct his path, says Ron, according to the Bible. Or could his story be the work of apologists? I think he probably did correct his path. He was probably somebody who did bad things and realized when he did, he may have written those psalms and those songs. But at the same time, I think it's very evident that he continued to do what he was doing. This is who he was. David was the kind of guy that would repeat his sins, if you will. It's like trying to hold back an ancient Middle Eastern monarch from doing the things he would naturally do. And it's like, oh, I killed that other opponent. God, I'm sorry. I know. Israel, set apart, supposed to be different. I know, my heart's supposed to be I had to get those guys out of the way, though. You know, if I didn't do that, I'd have problems over here. I'm sorry. Forgive me, God. I'm still the man after seeking your heart. You know, I could see that. I'm being a little flippant with it, but you can see it. Killed another adversary. I didn't really want to kill him. I had to kill him. You understand, God. You know how things are. So, I think David did ask for forgiveness. I think he was at times a man that sought God's heart, but I don't think he was good at it. I think he was just a guy who was a brilliant strategist or a brilliant schemer, and he made things work. Let's see. FP page got taken down before Alex Jones, says Jeannie. Let's see. They're still fighting over there, Wolf says. Yeah, you're right. They are. Right now, Israel's on top of their game. Let's see. And there were good kings of Israel. Now you'll see, too, we won't hit it so much in this series, but after the time of Solomon, the kingdom breaks up again. It becomes Israel and Judah again. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And if you remember the story of Jesus going from Judah to Israel, and there was the land of the Samaritans that lay in between. And he had the encounter of talks about the good Samaritan, where that comes from. It was the guy from Samaria crossing over in between the borders. So it was even still a divided kingdom at the time of Jesus, but still all considered Canaan or Palestine much later. So, and that's one of the things nowadays. That's part of the reason why, and I mentioned this in reading the Exodus Reality, when they're working on cities like archaeologically, like Avaris. That's a big kind of a thing that Egypt likes to keep quiet because they don't want to give the current state of Israel any political claim to any Egyptian territory. And if Egypt acknowledges that the Israelites built the city of Avaris beneath the treasure cities of Ramses II, Pi-Ramses, they're in sense, they believe that they're going to be giving the current state of Israel the right to that land. And because it was given to their ancestors by the Pharaoh. I don't think it's history. But that conflict even goes on today, that perception. So let's see. With all this stuff going on with FB, by the way, it's all politics nowadays. So all this stuff going on, it's all in front of the Senate. I just posted something from Senator Crenshaw on all this talk about Google and all of that and hate speak and blah, 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 and blocking, in essence, people's free speech. So let's see. FB Jail, I see mentioned in here by Jeannie or Scott Dowers. Yeah, I've been in FB jail once or twice. Not long. I try to avoid it. I try to be diplomatic. But let's see. Keyboard has gone Nazi on you. Nagamati. Got to finish reading it. Let's see. Ebron. Have mine. He was good once. Maybe kingship went to his head. You know, I'm not sure. Because it seems to be from the very beginning there's an apologetic covering up his story, Melinda. So I'm not sure about that. The U Tribe, the YouTube, and FB. Yeah, I see that. I started, liked it, just got to get around the rest of it. I understand, Wolf. I have a couple of books. Sometimes I have to change it up. I hear you. Say no to the blocking of free speech. Even hate speech can have a platform so we can call crap on it. That's right. You know, hate speech. What is hate speak? What is hate speech? The extreme left calling conservatives Nazis? That's hate speak. I'm sorry, it is. It's all hate speak, if such a thing really exists. So there you go. Folks, we're kind of up to date on the comments. And that's a totally other topic. Getting into that, we can maybe talk about that. We'll talk about that on Rocky's and My Show, The Situation Room, but not tonight because it's technically Saturday night for us by the time midnight hits. It's now 2 minutes to 11 Central Standard Time, 2 minutes to midnight Eastern Time, which means it's 2 minutes to Saturday over there on the East Coast. And I want to thank you all for being here, listening, giving me your time. Do you know how much that means to me that you just sit here and listen while you're doing whatever you're doing? I appreciate that you're here. And I hope you're getting something out of this, that this means something, that it brings another dimension to the way you think. The way you, in a sense, like Jeff says, unindoctrinate yourself. So there we go for tonight. Next time, we're going to get back into David. And as you can see, I'm generally doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday with my presentations. And then I do Thursday with the consequential rapscallions. Then every night, Sunday night through Thursday night, or technically Monday early morning through Friday early morning, out east, doing the Situation Room with Rocky. And every now and then a random something every now and then. Now, I'm here alone all weekend. My family's gone for the weekend. I'm batching it. It's quiet. It's fun. So I might hop on and do some things over the weekend. I'll try to give you a little advance warning if I'm going to do that. And but it'll be right here. Same bad time, same bad station. Well, maybe a different bad time over the weekend. So if you want to see our stuff, go to Streaming Talk Radio. Easy enough to remember. StreamingTalkRadio.com. You'll see everything with the Situation Room with Rocky Stucci, with me, with the professor, with Jeff Dougherty's on there. And you'll start to be able to find places to buy some of our goods, our T-shirts and things like that, and get acclimated and find out all you can about us. My link to my personal website's on there. If you want to get on there, you can see links to my articles and different things I do. So thanks. I love you guys. Susie Q, this chat room loves you. And favor to you as well. Thanks, John. I didn't see you earlier. Thanks, John. I appreciate it. John Senecal. And Brian Parker, good to see you. Love to you. I'd love to be on your podcast, Brian. You say when. And I keep trying to feel better. You notice my voice pretty much lasted the whole night tonight, 2 hours. So thanks for sticking around for 2 hours. You know, I get to talk and I don't realize 2 hours have gone by. So let's see. Suze, yes, you message me shortly. I'll be around. I'm going to go step out and get a drink and blah, blah, blah. Thanks for being here, folks. Love you too, Jeannie. Love you, everybody. I mean that. Thanks for being here. Means a lot to me that you'd be here and give me your time. And I will talk to you soon. Probably sometime over the weekend. If by any chance I don't, or we don't see each other, Monday night for sure, 9 p.m. Central Standard, 10 o'clock Eastern. See you then. Have a good weekend.